Why does the economic elite and the oligarchy and the political class care to diversify populations ethnically? On one level, there's the old idea that, well, if the purchasing power standards in Europe are high and people want to maintain their purchasing power, they will not be willing to work for lower salaries. So it makes sense economically that certain business interests would want to import workers from parts of the world that are impoverished and who are willing to work for less. Obviously, there's also the idea of political parties thinking that immigrants will vote for them and wanting to change the political demography in order to stay in power. Now, there's a pretty good report on this from the Terra Nova think tank in France, relatively prominent think tank. Back in 2011, they made this explicit when they talked about how, well, if the left is going to be losing working class voters for various reasons, it needs to keep together a new coalition, but they really emphasize the immigrant. There's also a very good recent report by demographer Paul Morland and economist Philip Pilkington titled Migration, Stagnation, or Procreation, Quantifying the Demographic Trilemma.
Is what I call the demographic trilemma, which is something that I wrote about in my most recent book, Tomorrow's People. The idea of the trilemma is you can have two, but not all three, of the following things. You can have small families, you can have economic dynamism, and you can have low immigration, ethnic continuity, if you like. You can have two, but not three of those things. There is a trade-off between them. Britain has also had 50 years, 2 generations of below replacement fertility rate. And the result is that Britain cannot have, for want of a better term, ethnic continuity. Britain needs, if it wants those two things, if it wants small families and a buoyant economy, it needs to have mass immigration.
Social cohesion is mentioned by the authors, but has a negative consequence of politicians pursuing necessary population replacement through migration because they want economic growth and because locals aren't having enough kids. And although it's very good, it precisely ignores or de-emphasizes the possible incentive on the part of political classes to increase diversity in order to increase their ability to control society or to implement policy projects. The dominant mainstream discourse in the West has tended to treat any resistance against this trend as racist and unacceptable. It's attempted to close the debate and pathologize any voice questioning the demographic transformation of society through migration. The left should absolutely care about this because it means mass migration is an elite project, a project that advances control by the political class and entrenched economic interests. It's an attempt to turn the global north into a constant suction device, stealing the youth and vitality of a economically devastated global south.
So it's unfair. I think some of the aspects of brain drain that we impose on other countries is actually unfair. I called that biological imperialism once for your
Nice. So on the family stuff then, what's your view?
Well, we have a demographics crisis, a looming demographics crisis. We're not having enough children to replace the people in the economy, and this will lead to an aging society. The short answer for the Navarro audience is you can't have a welfare state in an aging population. You can't, okay? And immigration, heated debate, whatever, but trust me, it'll run into political limits. It's already running into political limits. And it's not actually a long-term solution anyway.
Well, yeah, but I was going to say, because these trends are worldwide.
Because these trends are worldwide, exactly. And and by the way, the world's catching up in terms of income.
Economists think that if you have more of anything, you increase supply, its price will go down, except when we're talking about people. And economists have a hard time admitting that when it comes to immigrants, that immigrants might lower the wage. And there's, a very famous graph that Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty drew in the late 90s, showing income inequality in America as being enormously high at the time they first have data, which is in the very early 20th century. It dips down to a nadir around 1970, and then it's picked back up again until we're almost back where they were. There's another graph that looks hugely like that, which is the graph of the fraction of American residents who were foreign born. It was about 15% in the Gilded Age, and it went down to, I think, about 7. That number I'm a bit shaky on, around 1968, 70, and then it's now back to about 15% again. Now, the historian Jeff Cowie has a wonderful book in which he argues that the great migration of African Americans from the rural South to factories in the North could not have happened without the mid-century immigration restriction, because the factory owners would rather have brought in Serbs or Italians or Germans or Irish, but they weren't available because there were incredibly strict immigration restrictions. And so they were forced essentially to hire African Americans. And so the argument is that that is a wonderful example, if it's true. And remember, this is history, not formal econometrics. Right. If it's true, then that restriction of immigration brought up some of the worst treated people in America and really changed their lives in a really, really very positive way.
I used to believe that story myself, at least to some extent. I sort of don't believe it, but only sort of believe it now, because there's some evidence, and immigrants do take very different jobs from native-born Americans.
But you know, one of the arguments you hear all the time is immigrants take jobs that Americans won't take. Those people, anyone who says that should be thrown away, should be discarded and yelled at, unless they mention something about wages. You know, because the question is, you can't say Americans won't take that job. If you paid them enough, they would take that job.
Yeah.
You know, so that's one of the things you learn in Economics 101.
Is there some deeper problem that's not being addressed? Is there a burgeoning anti-establishment sentiment that's being felt across the world that people are unable to express without being condemned as far-right lunatics or racist? I'd have to say, as a person that was closely affiliated, albeit perhaps incorrectly, with what you might call left-wing and liberal politics, and now appear to be more associated with conspiracy and right-wing politics, I would say that I've always been incredibly sympathetic to anybody that would have to flee their home nation in order to seek a better life. But I've always felt that it's ordinary working people who generally are most impacted when there are huge demographic shifts, the type that are caused by migration crisis. And I've always felt that ordinary working people's voices are not heard.
That if you're an undocumented person in this country and you can pass the physical and the required test, background test, the like, you can serve in our military, and if you do it honorably, we will make you citizens of the United States. Do we need that? Do you know what the recruiting numbers are at the Army and the Navy and the Air Force? They can't reach their quotas each month.
So there it is. The reason why our border has about the same level of security as your Facebook page is because we need foreign slaves as conscripts. That's what we do. The Yankees are wising up to the scam of these foreign wars, and what's going to drive people into the shredder? The old standby, desperation. Doing why they want this open border, one of the big reasons is because the billionaire class wants to suppress the wages of Americans, and that's a fact. And I'm totally on board with that right now. And if you say that, Bernie Sanders used to say that.
The same holds true when it comes to agricultural workers. In our state of Illinois, we desperately need them for virtually every aspect of farming and agriculture. Are they available and ready to come? Yes, but they need a change in the immigration law to reach that. Point I'm trying to make is that
you're a tool of the billionaire class, and you want to suppress wages in America and fill our country with foreigners to take jobs that Americans would fill if they were paid a decent wage.
We see a key limitation in how the political right thinks about nations and about economics. It's a limitation that exists also in the apparently rebellious anti-establishment right in the United States, the America First Republicans.
It is a hard fact today that we do have more jobs in this country than we do have people. Talk to any small business, talk to any large business. It's just a fact that that's an impediment to economic growth.
This is exactly wrong. There will always be a business sector demanding lower wages, demanding cheaper labor. But if the demand for labor is high and there is a lack of supply, i.e., of workers willing to do that job for the price, the salary that it's offered at, then the price of labor just went up. You're going to have to pay more to attract the supply that exists. If your argument is that no, there's someone else somewhere around the world desperate enough to do that job for the salary that the employer wants to offer, then you don't see nationhood as primary. You don't see community as primary. You see economics, and specifically the interests of the employer as primary, rather than treating the free market or supply and demand dynamics, the price mechanism, as a, let's say, metabolic process that happens within the body of a community. You actually treat the community as being within a market that you conceive of as global. Anyone, anywhere around the world willing to do a job for a certain salary should be brought in. I mean, that's really the key here. We're not talking about a society with markets. We're talking about a market society, and specifically we're conceiving of the market really as global. So it's not America first or nationalistic as Ramaswamy would present it. And you could always argue, well, no, there are certain jobs that have to be done for a lower salary. People in the first world are just unwilling to work for that salary, but if you pay them more, that business in which that job is taking place stops being viable. If that's really the case, then you're going to have to move the job to the worker rather than the worker to the job. In other words, if that's really the case, then put that factory, whatever it is, elsewhere in the developing world, where people can do that job without having to move and uproot their families, or themselves at least, and that way keep the cultural cohesion of the first world country from which the job originates. If it's genuinely an issue of business viability completely being lost if you pay first world wages for a certain job.
So, I think it is a fair criticism when people say you want unlimited merit-based immigration, you say no cap, that those are symbiotic positions or criticisms. And I think what you should know on behalf of the base, on behalf of American middle-class voters, you talk about what's best for America. Are you talking about the people that own companies and stock, or the middle class?
There's also the argument that if you have a automation and AI revolution about to happen, then the future doesn't really need us. A lot of jobs are no longer necessary. So there is going to be some kind of attempt to reduce birth rates. And you just happen to be seeing that more in the richer parts of the world that are farther along that change. So it seems like their populations are being replaced by people from elsewhere, but actually we're all heading in the same direction. I think that's partly true as well. Indeed, fertility is actually falling all around the world and falling faster outside of the West, where it was higher, but it is still overall lower in Europe and Western countries, or first world countries. And because these are the countries that are receiving mass immigration, they are the ones where the population transformation is taking place. But I think there's more to it. I think that there is a sense in which the political class conceives of diversity as an instrument for reducing social cohesion and making society easier to control in general.